Chapter 9 of The Way to Willpower by Henry Hazlitt. Chapter 9. The Omnipresence of Habit. Thus far I have spoken as if desires and fears and aversions were the sole determinants of action. We come now to something quite as important, if indeed it is not more important than these. While it is often determined by them, it sometimes determines them, and it often guides action with no relation to desires whatever. From the title of this chapter, the astute reader will have already surmised what I am talking about. We may best approach the phenomenon of habit by going outside of the individual and his brain. Habit applies to the inanimate no less than to the animate world. Fold a napkin in a particular way, and it is more easy to fold that way the next time. The creases in a sheet of wrapping paper become indelible. An automobile engine runs more smoothly after it has been worked in, and the friction edges worn down. The very clothes on your back form habits. They fit you better after you have worn them for some time than when they are new. They drape more snugly to the form. The notorious difference in comfort between old and new shoes is possible because the old shoes have been worked into certain feet-conforming habits. A path across a field, be it never so winding, becomes beaten more and more, becomes more distinct and unalterable. That is because it becomes more and more the path of least resistance. And the tendency of all bodies and forces, animate and inanimate, to follow the path of least resistance is the secret of the formation of habit. You assert that the field path is formed by human beings, creatures of habit, the beaten path, and of ruts. I answer by the illustration of a riverbed, which the water follows, though the bed twist and turn and wind. Originally it was formed by sheer accident, as the water, beginning as a spring on a hill or mountaintop, bubbled up, made its way around this rock, over that, split here, joined there, washing away the gravel as it went, digging its bed deeper and deeper, more firm and more unchangeable, till at last it flowed in a full, deep, untroubled current. You have doubtless seen the bed of a spring or brook dried up at certain seasons of the year. The definition of a brook is a body of water. Yet you know, though there is no water here, that this is indeed the brook, for this is the path the water will take when it flows again. The dried-up brook bed represents what a habit is like in the brain when you are not acting upon it. A more familiar comparison to those who live in the world created by man and not by nature is the groove in a phonographic record, silent in itself, but always ready to produce a tune, and always the same tune when it is put on. That is to say, when the circumstances call it forth. The omnipresence of habit is almost terrifying when one reflects upon it. From the minute a man shuts off his alarm clock on one morning, till the minute he shuts it off on the next morning, it controls him. It dictates and makes possible 9/10 of his actions. And 9/10 of the habits of most men are formed unconsciously. It is astounding that men should so leave this thing to chance when it determines the very texture of their lives. Yet the fact must be recorded. A man gets up at 8 because it is his habit to get up at 8, though he has set his alarm and his intentions to arise at 7:30. If it is his habit in a vacant way to contemplate getting up for 15 minutes before he actually does get up, that he will do every morning. When he actually gets up, habit dictates which sock shall go on first, whether shirt or trousers shall go on first, whether collar or shoes shall take precedence, which shoe shall be put on before the other, whether he begins buttoning his vest from the bottom or from the top. At this very private stage of his toilet, we shall leave him a moment for a digression. This digression is needed to point out that habit is not always evil. The same confusion of thought exists in regard to habit and about being a slave to habit that clusters around the word desire. Most of the average man's habits are not only good, but indispensable. Habit may be formally defined as an aptitude or inclination for some action acquired by frequent repetition and showing itself in increased faculty of performance or in decreased power of resistance. Less correctly, but more practically, I should define habit as the doing of a thing without conscious attention, and often without thought of the purpose of doing it. Most men cannot tell you how they dress, which shoe they put on first, or whether they button their vests from the top or bottom, until they first mentally rehearse the action, or even until they actually do it. As to the great blessings of habit, Dr. Maudsley says, quote, "If an act became no easier after being done several times, if the careful direction of consciousness were necessary to its accomplishment on each occasion, it is evident that the whole activity of a lifetime might be confined to one or two deeds, that no progress could take place in development. A man might be occupied all day in dressing and undressing himself. The attitude of his body would absorb all his attention and energy. The washing of his hands or the fastening of a button would be as difficult to him on each occasion as to the child on its first trial. And he would, furthermore, be completely exhausted by his exertions. Think of the pains necessary to teach a child to stand, of the many efforts which it must make, and of the ease with which it at last stands unconscious of any effort." End quote. Returning now to our typical man and his morning toilet, we follow him downstairs to his breakfast. Habit dictates what he eats, whether his breakfast is light or heavy, whether he takes a cereal or not, whether his fried eggs are turned or not. Habit has already dictated what time he usually arrives at breakfast. It must, therefore, inevitably dictate whether he shall bolt his breakfast or take it leisurely. Habit dictates whether he props his paper in front of him at breakfast or whether he waits until he boards his train. Habit dictates his table manners. Habit dictates his tone of voice to his wife. If he boards a train, habit dictates whether he shall get on at the rear car or the second car from the front. Arrived at his office, habit dictates the manner in which he approaches his work, the way he handles interviews, his professional mannerisms, his tricks of gesture, his choice of words, his very manner of thinking and looking at things. Habit dictates the time he goes out to lunch and the place to which he goes. Many a man with a special luncheon engagement at an unhabitual place has suddenly checked himself to remember it after finding that his feet had mysteriously carried him right up to the very door of his customary restaurant. Finally, when he has returned home and taken his dinner, habit dictates how he shall spend the evening. If he is in the habit of going out every night, he will feel restless and uncomfortable staying in. He will go out not for enjoyment, but because he knows not what else to do. He knows merely that the thought of staying home is intolerable. His so-called pleasures, far from spontaneous, fall into certain conventionalized and accepted activities, which may be called social habits, habits possessed by the community at large. They will differ between one country and another, between one town in the same country and another. Our man will find himself for a period going frequently out to play poker. Then, for another period, he will find his most frequent diversion will be going to dances. For a while, it will be going to the theater or the movies. For another period, it may be bowling. Then it will be staying at home to read. Such habits change with seasons, by sheer accident, and in different periods of life. The evenings of some men are as much a burden to them as their business day. Their evening's outing is as much a duty as earning their bread and cheese. As they dress to go out, they sigh. They are about to embark on one of the accredited methods of having a good time. It often does not occur to them to ask whether they are actually having it. They vaguely regard going out as a sort of necessity, like fate. They are indeed slaves of habit. But our man's day is not ended. He returns home. Habit dictates the hour at which he retires, even though he has made 1,000 resolutions, night after night, that he shall hereafter retire an hour earlier. In fact, the nightly resolution itself may be a habit. The resolution is usually made in the morning, for an outside influence, his employer or the relentless call of business, has pretty definitely fixed the hour at which he must arise. His manner of undressing is as definitely fixed as his manner of dressing. He puts out the light, opens the window, and goes to bed. Habit dictates the position he assumes in bed, and perhaps how deeply he sleeps or fails to sleep. We have pursued our typical man enough, and we leave him. There are worse than he. Absent-minded persons not accustomed to changing their dress to go out of an evening, and intending only to take off a few articles, have found themselves getting completely undressed and proceeding to go to bed. You who laugh irreverently at this, who boast that you are free from unthinking habit and that you act only with thought, kindly make this experiment. Perhaps you carry your watch in your lower right-hand vest pocket, the chain across your vest, your keys or knife or ornament in the other pocket, on the end of the chain. Reverse it. Put your watch in your lower left-hand pocket. Now, without making any special effort either to forget or to remember that you have shifted your watch, wait until an unplanned occasion to use it arises and see how many times you reach in your right-hand pocket for it and pull out the other end of the chain before finally a new habit is formed. Or put your watch in your upper pocket and see how many times you reach for your lower pocket and think frantically for a moment that your watch is gone. Or shift your silver change from your trousers to your coat pocket, or from your right to your left, and see how many times your wrong hand dives into the wrong place. Habit makes possible the acquisition of all skilled movement. The practice that makes perfect, the practice at swimming, tennis, skating, dancing, bowling, juggling, automobile driving, and stunting with an airplane, is nothing more and nothing less than the formation of habit. I have learned to operate a typewriter by touch. As I write these words, I do not have to pick out the letters on the keyboard. I do not look at the keyboard. I do not even think of the letters. I think only of what I am going to say. I watch the words on the paper as they marvelously form, and my fingers, without attention from me, are mysteriously finding their way with lightning rapidity to the proper keys. Habit. And if I should start to think consciously of my fingers or the keys, I should begin to make mistakes, and my speed would slow up. If you are still not sufficiently impressed with the importance of habit, let me quote to you the words not of a moralist given to sermonizing, but the dry, scientific statement of fact by a psychologist, W.B. Pillsbury. Quote, "The useful man is for the greater part marked off from the useless and the vicious by the nature of his habits. Industry or indolence, good temper or bad temper, even virtue or vice are in the last analysis largely matters of habit. One forms the habit of working at certain times of the day, and soon if one is not busy at that time, one experiences a lively sense of discomfort. Or on the contrary, one forms the habit of loafing all day. Work then becomes distasteful, and indolent irresponsibility is established. Losing one's temper is largely a habit, as is self-control. Each time one is provoked by a trifle, it becomes the more difficult to look calmly at an unpleasant episode. While each time one remains calm under difficult circumstances, strength is gained for later difficulties. Similarly, whenever temptation is resisted, virtue gains a victory. When temptation is yielded to, new weaknesses develop. Frequent yielding makes resistance practically impossible. A bank president of established morals could no more step out and pick a pocket that was temptingly unprotected than he could fly. The habitual drunkard can no more resist the invitation to have a glass than he can resist the action of gravitation while falling freely through space. Frequent giving in has entirely destroyed his original freedom of choice." End quote. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Alteration of Habit. Habit being of such enormous importance, it is our urgent duty to seek the means of forming good habits and of breaking bad ones. How does habit become possible? For the answer to that, one must turn to that strange and awe-compelling mass of gray and white matter boxed within the bones of the skull. The brain is composed of an immense number of separate and minute cells called neurons. Each is connected potentially with a number of other neurons. The points of connection are called synapses. We may visualize the brain as a network of delicate piping, or exquisitely slender tubes, each tube containing a number of valves leading to other tubes. The tubes are the neurons, the valves the synapses. When a stimulus comes from the outside world, it sends a mysterious current, which we may envision as the current of some fluid like water, through one of the tubes. This forces itself out of one of the valves into the particular tube leading from that valve. This tube in turn has a number of valves, and the current forces its way out of the one most easily opened, and so on, until the current emerges finally in the form of an action. In this picture, I have represented as tubes nerves, as well as neurons. The tubes which send incoming messages to the brain are called sensory nerves. Those which carry out the orders of the brain are called motor nerves. If the outward stimulus is an itch, the message is carried by an adjacent sensory nerve to the brain, passes through the tubes and valves there, the neurons and synapses, and emerges through a motor nerve in the form of the action of scratching. Or the itch is discovered by some nerve in the eye to be due to a scab, which it would be harmful to scratch. This nerve sets up a countercurrent. Other valves are opened and others kept closed, and the action of scratching does not follow. Certain valves or synapses are from birth predisposed to open with particular ease. The special paths which these make possible are called instincts. The infant feeds on its mother's breasts at birth. It has had no experience, no knowledge. It may not be able to see. Yet a particular sensation awakens a particular response. The instincts we have in common. In addition to these inherited paths, which all have, there are paths open in the brain at birth, which vary in different individuals. These we call innate characteristics. Now, while these paths of instinct and innate characteristics are often highly useful, they are sometimes exceedingly dangerous. They need to be supplemented by experience and knowledge, which dictate the opening of new or altered paths. When a path is once taken, it wears down the valves, the synapses, through which it passes. Those valves open so much the easier thereafter, and the taking of that path becomes so much easier the next time. On the next passage of the current, those particular synapses open more easily still, until the time may come when they will form the only possible path, when it will be impossible for the well-worn valve to offer more resistance to the onrushing current than the valve seldom or never opened. Such is the physiologist's explanation of habit, and it is at once a despair and a glorious promise. Forming a new habit is like forging for yourself a new path in the woods through stubborn underbrush and prickly thorns, while all the while it is possible for you to take the well-worn, hard-trodden, pleasant path that already exists. But you can reflect that every time you travel through the new path, you are going to tramp down more shrubbery and clear more entanglements from the way. Every time you take the path, it is going to become easier. And that is the cheerful side. When you first set about to abolish a bad habit and establish a good one, it is going to take all the effort, all the willpower at your command. But habit begins soon to take the place of willpower. It will require less and less effort, less and less willpower each time. The strain diminishes until in time it disappears. For the practice of that particular virtue, willpower has become almost useless. Willpower is not needed all the time. It is called for only at the period of change. But the period of change is all important. It is better not to be too ambitious and not to try to change too many habits at once. Yet as soon as you find one new method of response becoming automatic, you may turn to another. You will always find another. No matter how long you live nor how diligent you are, you will never exhaust the supply of new good habits that it is possible to form, nor the supply of old bad habits it is possible to break. And all the time you will be keeping alive the faculty of effort within you. Putting forth moral effort, or failing to, is itself a habit. All this comes into the head of what William James would call making our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy, which consists in making automatic and habitual as early as possible as many useful actions as we can. James, building on the suggestions of Bain, has laid down several maxims of habit which it would be difficult to improve upon. Quote, "The first is that in the acquisition of a new habit or the leaving off of an old one, we must take care to launch ourselves with as strong and decided an initiative as possible. Accumulate all the possible circumstances which shall reinforce the right motives. Put yourself assiduously in conditions that encourage the new way. Make engagements incompatible with the old. Take a public pledge, if the case allows. In short, envelop your resolution with every aid you know. This will give your new beginning such a momentum that the temptation to break down will not occur as it otherwise might. And every day during which a breakdown is postponed adds to the chances of its not occurring at all." End quote. In this connection, let me say a word about the effect of a change of environment upon a change of habit. In our ordinary life, a certain routine is laid down from us from without, and this largely controls the routine developed from within. Our hours of business and the hours at which we take our meals, the time it takes to get from the office to the home, and the method that must be taken, the very arrangement of furniture in our room, all help to engender and develop and petrify certain habits. But if a break should occur in this routine, if the hours or the nature of our business should be changed, if we should move from the city to the country, a vast number of our habits would be changed perforce. Such changes in environment should be welcomed when they occur. They should be recognized and seized upon as rare opportunities for the conscious formation of new useful habits and the breaking of old bad ones. The old habits were made possible because they were unconsciously suggested by associations in the old environment. But when we change, we can no longer do some of the old things absent-mindedly because the old responses are not suggested, and often they do not fit. Reform on our habits of rising and retiring, in the hasty or leisurely eating of our meals, and many another daily custom that determines our life happiness, thus becomes more possible. But the trouble is that most of us, when such opportunities come, fail to appreciate them, and fall again unconsciously, without deliberate choice, into habits as bad as the habits we left. Returning to the James Bain maxims, the second is, quote, "Never suffer an exception to occur till the new habit is securely rooted in your life. Each lapse is like the letting fall of a ball of string which one is carefully winding up. A single slip undoes more than a great many turns will wind again. Continuity of training is the great means of making the nervous system act infallibly right." End quote. A German writer has remarked, quote, "He who every day makes a fresh resolve is like one who, arriving at the edge of the ditch he is to leap, forever stops and returns for a fresh run." End quote. This leads to James's third maxim, which is, quote, "Seize the very first possible opportunity to act on every resolution you make, and on every emotional prompting you may experience in the direction of the habits you aspire to gain. It is not in the moment of their forming, but in the moment of their producing motor effects that resolves and aspirations communicate the new set to the brain. No matter how full a reservoir of maxims one may possess, and no matter how good one's sentiments may be, if one has not taken advantage of every concrete opportunity to act, one's character may remain entirely unaffected for the better." End quote. And to impress his remarks, James gives a final example. Quote, "The drunken Rip Van Winkle in Jefferson's play excuses himself for every fresh dereliction by saying, 'I won't count this time.' Well, he may not count it, and a kind heaven may not count it, but it is being counted nonetheless. Down among his nerve cells and fibers, the molecules are counting it, registering and storing it up to be used against him when the next temptation comes. Nothing we ever do is, in strict scientific literalness, wiped out." End quote. Oh, the pathos of telling yourself when each new temptation arises, "I will begin to reform the next time. I will yield this time, and this time will be the last." Oh, the tragedy of that excuse. Self-deception could not possibly be more complete. If you can only tell yourself when temptation arises, not that this time will be the last, but that the last time was the last. If you can only repeat that to yourself, if you can only force your attention to rivet on that fact, if you can only realize that the whole force of your will and moral effort must be summoned now, and not at some vague time in the future, if you can burn into your mind that this battle, this inward struggle against temptation, is the only real and crucial one, if you can forget about the moral struggles won or lost in the past, or that you expect to win in the future, and concentrate only upon the present battle, then truly, you will be on the way to willpower. And it is the only way. Moral sentiments, fine ideals, excellent mottos, splendid resolutions are all mere preparation for the struggle. They are all very well in their place, but if they do not express themselves in action and express themselves at the moment when temptation has come, they are worse than useless. There was once a man whose wife, for curious reasons, was beaten by another man. This beating occurred regularly. The other man would break into the house, flog the wife unmercifully in front of the husband until she fell unconscious, and then leave. The other man was bigger than the husband, so the husband could not fight back. But the husband bought himself a revolver. It was a beautiful revolver with an exquisite pearl handle, and its nickel finish glistened in the sun. The husband loaded it. The other man came again, beat the man's wife until she screamed for mercy, and left her prostrate. But where was the husband, you ask? He was right on the scene. Didn't he use his revolver? You persist. Well, the fact must be admitted that a very strange thing happened. When the other man came, the husband was so frightened that he dropped his revolver and ran. This happened again and again. It may be said to the husband's credit, however, that every time the beating was over and the other man had left, the husband always came back, picked up his revolver, petted it lovingly, polished it again, pointed it with great magnificent determination at an imaginary object and said, "Ah, wait till he comes next time." This is a parable. It is hardly necessary to point out that the other man symbolizes the man's temptations and cravings and baser instincts, that the wife symbolizes his better self, that the revolver symbolizes his ideals, and the cartridges his sentiments and mottos and resolutions. In the moment when they were needed, these cartridges did not go off, they did not explode, they were not effective, and the simple reason was that the man did not summon the effort to pull the trigger. You need ask yourself only one question about this parable, but your answer must be honest. Does the husband symbolize me? End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. Will and the Psychoanalysts. Practically within the last few years, there has grown up a body of doctrine, gradually becoming surrounded with a formidable literature, which its proponents call a science. And I shall not start an argument at the very beginning by denying its title to that word. This body of doctrine is called psychoanalysis. It is not quite clear whether its adherents consider it a branch of psychology or a competitor. But at all events, it has just now become ubiquitous. It is in the air. It is the fad. It has come out of the laboratories into the drawing rooms, out of the consulting rooms into the newspapers. It is discussed by doctors and book reviewers and spinsters and schoolgirls. It deals with human action, with the mind, the will, the desires. It lays down recommendations, and any modern book upon the will, though it may embrace or damn psychoanalysis, cannot afford to ignore it. Now, it is very difficult to pass fair judgment upon this body of doctrine. It is so young. It has already, to my mind, made not unimportant steps in the treatment and cure of insanity and nervous diseases, and bids fair to make greater. Its theories of multiple personalities and the meaning of dreams seem to me fruitful working hypotheses, destined to add to the achievements of psychiatry. Its explanations of Puritanism and of certain phases of war psychology, utterly apart from the question of whether or not they have scientific value, are delicious and effective bits of satire. And as with Thornton Veblen's work in economics, the satire is heightened, not diminished, by the dry scientific vocabulary in which it is wrapped, and the impartial scientific attitude which it affects. Psychoanalysis doubtless is proceeding on many wrong theories, but it is constantly testing those theories. And as time goes on, the bad will be cast upon the scrap heap and new and better theories substituted. It is tapping and specializing upon a vein which the academic psychology had neglected. It has attracted wide popular interest. It has brought controversy into psychology. And controversy, with experiments to prove or disprove, always means life and growth and progress, and is the enemy of stagnation. It is true that the literature of psychoanalysis is morbid, gruesome, depressing, filled with sexual perversions, with incest, sadism, masochism, onanism, sodomy. But what would you? Medical books on physical diseases are also horrible, but necessary. Spiritual scabs and ravages and pus are more revolting than physical. But like the physical, if we are to combat them, we must study them with the cold, detached impartiality of the physician. We must for the moment put aside our moral platitudes and denunciations and contempt and study the disease and its cure. The physician does not denounce his patient for becoming ill, though the patient may well deserve it. He seeks first to restore health. Admonition can only follow. But when I have said all this in favor of psychoanalysis, I have said almost as much as I conscientiously can. Few of its practitioners are well grounded in psychology, and fewer in biology and medicine. It utilizes orthodox medicine, biology, psychology, anatomy, and physiology when they can be used to prove a special point, and rejects them when they cannot. There is hardly a single analyst who could be called a cautious thinker. Most of them do not appear to know the difference between a substantiated theory and a guess. Presumptive evidence is set down as if it were conclusive evidence. Some of their deductions are highly fanciful. They would be extremely difficult to verify, and there is usually no attempt at verification. Whenever human nature is praised, proof is required. But apparently, whenever it is satirized or insulted, proof is deemed superfluous. The most dubious conjecture, based on the frailest kind of evidence, is set down with the positive air of a fact. Explanations for which the best that can be said is that they are possible or plausible are treated as if they were the final and only ones, though alternative explanations, at least equally and possibly more plausible, and certainly nowhere near as far-fetched, may occur to a person not altogether hypnotized by the Freudian interpretation. It is one of the foremost Freudian theories, if indeed it is not the foremost, that every dream, not some dreams, mind you, but every one, represents the gratification of some desire suppressed or repressed during the waking state. This desire, according to Freud, is practically always a sexual one. At least the predominance of the sexual element appears to be overwhelming. Now, such a theory in its bald state would not impose upon a half-witted person. So the psychoanalysts go on to show that most of our dreams are symbolic. And what ingenious symbolism! The unconscious mind asleep seems to be infinitely more clever than the conscious mind awake. It is also a theory of Freud's that every act, every slip of the tongue, every bit of absent-mindedness or forgetfulness means something. Forgetting a name, an event, or a figure is not merely a failure to remember. It is a positive act. We forget because we have an unconscious desire to forget. The fact or name is associated with something unpleasant, and the mind tends to reject it, or the unconscious to suppress it. I wish I had time for your edification to quote a few typical examples of the interpretations which the psychoanalysts give of different dreams and trivial acts in the light of these theories. Their capacity for reading anything they choose into anything they want is utterly enormous. You would sometimes think from a few of these interpretations that the psychoanalysts were satirizing or burlesquing themselves. Really, it is not so. But the reader who has sufficient psychologic curiosity to be interested in seeing how a theory can be ridden to death and then pulled to its feet and ridden again would find unsurpassed material by delving a little into psychoanalytic literature. A large part of the interest in psychoanalysis is almost wholly prurient. It is to the fact that it deals so largely with sex, I verily believe, that it owes the larger part of its popular vogue. It seems, too, to have a certain tendency to wallow in it and find a morbid fascination in it. Examples of sexual abnormalities are piled up with a relish not unlike that which gossiping people have in retailing scandal, and often apparently with the same object, to tell the tale for the sake of the tale. The examples are usually more than are needed to enforce a given conclusion, though the exact bearing of each upon the conclusion is not always indicated. There can be little doubt that the reading of psychoanalytic literature tends to suggest and arouse sexual trains of thought in the minds of many readers, and I am here speaking of normal readers, and not of what the psychoanalysts would call a sexually hypersensitive or hyperesthetic reader. The same, of course, may be true of a medical book. I am not condemning, I am merely stating a fact. This statement has been made before, and one psychoanalyst has attempted to answer it in this wise. Quote, "The sexual material is present in every subject, normal or abnormal, and comes to the surface very easily. No suggestion is necessary to bring it forth." End quote. That is emphatically not an answer. We have seen before in our inquiry into the nature of desire that desires are not ever present, but become active only when some train of thought or some external observation or stimulus has aroused them. And we illustrated by a phonograph record, which, while it preserves a tune, is silent when it isn't being played. The example of passing the fruit stand was given as a case in point. The like is true of sexual desires. Whether a desire comes to the surface or stays below is a point of very great importance. The psychoanalytic model is incomplete, insufficiently checked up by other methods, and rests upon some dubious assumptions. It seeks to interpret the normal mind through a study of the abnormal mind. This is a perfectly valid and useful method within proper limits, but it can be overdone and rashly handled. Quote, "The neurotic," says one psychoanalyst, "only accentuates certain general human traits and tendencies, and he makes them thereby easier to observe." End quote. Such a statement needs qualification. Instead of accentuating a trait of a normal man, the neurotic may be neurotic because he so greatly distorts it. Disease symptoms do not accentuate health symptoms. Finally, to all these sins, psychoanalysis adds the unforgivable crime of pedantry. I do not know of a science that habitually wraps its thoughts in such awesome and jaw-cracking phraseology, with such a maze of newly coined words, above all, habitually tacking on the magic word complex after describing any trait whatever in order to make it sound as if something very profound had been pointed out. When most of these psychoanalytic thoughts are disentangled from the verbiage in which they are snarled and concealed and lie before you in all their nakedness, they are seen to be either very commonplace and obvious, or very absurd. Such a discovery might be suspected in advance, for poverty of thought habitually tries to conceal itself beneath a deluge of diction. This may be a case of the unconscious or the inferiority complex forming a self-protective neurosis. But this is digressing. My purpose is not to criticize psychoanalysis as a whole, but to examine one of its cardinal doctrines, which seems to me to bear directly on the subject of willpower. But first, I shall have to explain what that doctrine is. The psychoanalysts lay a good deal of stress upon what is commonly called the subconscious, and what they call the unconscious. Their conception of the unconscious is vividly described by Mr. Andre Tridon in a book on psychoanalysis and behavior, from which I shall take the liberty of quoting. Quote, "Our unconscious contains two sorts of thoughts, those which rise easily to the surface of our consciousness, and those which remain at the bottom and can only be made to rise with more or less difficulty. Our unconscious mind is like a pool into which dead leaves, dust, raindrops, and 1,000 other things are falling day after day, some of them floating on the surface for a while, some sinking to the bottom, and all of them, after a while, merging themselves with the water or the ooze. Let us suppose that 2 dead dogs, one of them weighted down with a stone, have been thrown into that pool. They will poison its water, and people wishing to use those waters will have to rake the ooze and remove the rotting carrion. The dog whose body was not fastened to any heavy object will easily be brought to the surface and removed. The other will be more difficult to recover, and if the stone is very heavy, may remain in the pool until ways and means are devised to dismember him or to cut the rope holding him down." End quote. Now, these two dogs may be made to represent two sorts of desires or cravings. The first of these are cravings of which we are aware, but which, because they are immoral or socially detrimental, or difficult or impossible to gratify for some other reason, remain unacted upon. These are called suppressed desires. The second are cravings which we not only fail to gratify, but of whose very existence we are unaware. If someone were to suggest that we had such cravings, we might even vehemently, and perhaps honestly, deny it. These are called repressed desires. Now, say the psychoanalysts, though we can suppress or repress our cravings, we cannot annihilate them. To use one of their similes, quote, "Whether we remain in ignorance of the fact that a boiler is full of steam or simply disregard that fact, the steam is there, seeking an outlet and likely to create an abnormal one, unless a normal outlet is provided." End quote. What will this abnormal outlet be? According to the psychoanalysts, it may take several forms. Quote, "Between the compelling instinct and the opposing force of sexual denial, for instance, the way is prepared for some disturbance which does not solve the conflict, but seeks to escape it by changing the libidinous cravings into symptoms of disease." End quote. In other words, the suppression or repression of sexual cravings, they assert, will lead to anxiety dreams, nightmares, nervous disorders, intolerance, hallucinations, dual and multiple personalities, insanity, or burst out in abnormal sexual perversions of a revolting sort. They bring forth examples of perversions in great men. They point with a finger of warning at the ascetics and holy men and women who were fighting the flesh, and contend that these exchange normal reality for hallucinations and normal desires for perverse desires. And what cure do they suggest? Here I must be cautious and warn the reader that the psychoanalysts do not altogether agree upon this matter among themselves. I will try, however, as best I may, to do justice to the bulk of their opinion. They believe, first, that we should be made conscious of our repressed cravings. To make the subject conscious of these, they interpret his acts, study his dreams, unravel the symbolism, and gradually inform the patient what his repressed cravings are. This is cutting the rope that holds the dead dog down. The first job is to bring him to the surface. Critics have feared that causing these unconscious cravings to rise to consciousness may cause them to overpower the patient's ethical strivings. The belief has also been expressed that this method may suggest a craving or put into the mind of the patient a harmful idea that was not there before. Freud, the originator and patron saint of psychoanalysis, has answered to the first criticism that a wish whose repression has failed is incomparably stronger when it remains unconscious than when it is made conscious. The unconscious wish cannot be influenced and is not hindered by strivings in the opposite direction, while the conscious wish is inhibited by other conscious wishes of an opposing nature. I shall not take sides in this particular argument, but shall merely content myself with presenting the 2 points of view, leaving the reader to judge of their merits for himself. When the unconscious craving is brought to the surface, what becomes of it, and what is to be done with it? Partly, say the psychoanalysts, it is consumed and overpowered in the very act of bringing it up. Instead of being repressed, it is condemned. The psychoanalyst may also suggest healthy and normal and socially beneficial or harmless ways of gratifying it. But there is something further. It may, according to Freud, be sublimated. By sublimation, Freud understands a process which seeks to utilize the sexual energy, immobilized by repressions and set free by analysis, for higher purposes of a non-sexual nature. In other words, the components of the sexual energy can be made to exchange their sexual goal for one more remote and socially valuable. Quote, "To the utilization of the energy reclaimed in such a way, in the activities of our mental life, we probably owe the highest cultural achievements. As long as an impulse is repressed, it cannot be sublimated. After the removal of the repression, The way to sublimation is open." End quote. All this is interesting and promising, but alas, the doctrine is violently criticized by many other psychoanalysts. Quote, "No normal craving," says one, "can be normally repressed, nor can it be normally sublimated." End quote. And again, quote, "The desirability of sublimation, except as a social convenience, remains to be proved." End quote. In fact, it is doubtful to just what extent Freud himself believed in this theory. In one of his lectures, he said, quote, "If the repression of sexuality is pushed too far, it amounts to a robbery committed against the organism." End quote. He concluded this lecture with a story. A village community kept a horse which was capable of an enormous amount of work. But the wiseacres thought that it was proving too costly by consuming too much fodder. So they began to cut down its ration day by day. It finally got so small that the horse was living on one stalk of hay a day, with apparently no ill effects. The next morning, he was to be taken to work with no food at all. But on that morning, he was found dead in his stall. The sublimation of his craving for food had been complete. The suggestion is plain. Freud is putting the desire for sexual gratification in the same category as the desire for food. I cannot see the justice for that, and I am sorry if, in pointing out his fallacy, I am obliged to utter a few platitudes. Food is absolutely essential to the life of the individual from the day of birth. There is no one to deny it. Sexuality, however essential to the continuation of the race, has no indispensable connection with the individual. No one has ever been known to live without food. How many have lived without sexual gratification, no one can say. But I have no doubt that the number in its totality has been amazingly large. The psychoanalysts point to the monks and ordinary individuals who, attempting to deny the flesh, suffered from hallucinations or finally burst forth in abnormal perversions. Most of the examples they cite may be true. All of them may be true. But that would not prove their case. In order to do so, they would have to prove what the logicians call a universal negative. They would have to show that there has never been a case in which the flesh has been denied without physical injury or mental disturbance. Either that, or they would have to supply overwhelming evidence to show that on a priori grounds, such a thing is impossible. They have not done so. They have not come near doing so. And though it is impossible to prove beyond question of any given individual that he has not indulged in any sexual practice of any kind, yet there is abundant presumptive evidence that thousands of prominent churchmen, scientists, philosophers, and quite ordinary individuals have succeeded in absolute chastity and remained otherwise wholly normal. And before going any further, it would be well to call attention to a point of the highest importance. Altogether apart from the truth of one belief or the other, we must consider the moral effect of that belief. If you believe that you cannot get along without sexual or any other particular gratification, then assuredly you will not be able to. But if you believe that you can get along without it, you may have won half the victory. What you believe in this respect will have an overwhelming influence upon what you do. If you are convinced that repression or suppression will lead to mental torture or abnormal outlets, then this fear will be constantly before you. By thinking that you have to yield, you will yield. But if you are confident that the desire can be successfully fought, your confidence will vastly increase your strength to fight it. Whichever your belief, you will tend to make your belief true. One does not have to be a philosophic pragmatist to appreciate that. I hope I shall be forgiven for a liberal use of italics and repetition on this point. I think they are necessary. There is another question in regard to this matter. What is a normal craving? The psychoanalysts, and perhaps they are not alone in this, apparently put the sexual desire on all fours with the desire for food. But the satisfaction of the desire for food does not result in any reaction. It does not weaken a man. It does not depress. It does not enervate. It does not exhaust. And here we should draw a sharp distinction between two words that, up to now, I have been using almost interchangeably. I refer to the distinction between a desire and a craving. We have a desire for food, but a craving for cigarettes, whiskey, morphine. The first fills a positive need and gives a positive satisfaction. The second is largely negative. It may give a positive satisfaction at the beginning, but in its later stages, especially if one becomes a cigarette or a morphine fiend or a dipsomaniac, it merely relieves a sense of discomfort, agony, or torture from which one who is not an addict is wholly free. Is the sexual craving a normal craving simply because it is inborn, while a craving for tobacco, alcohol, or opium is abnormal because it is acquired? But if this distinction is valid, of what real practical importance is it so far as the individual is concerned? Surely the acquired craving may be fully as intense and overwhelming as the normal craving. People who do not believe this may ponder these examples quoted by Dr. Mussey. Quote, "A few years ago, a tippler was put into an almshouse in this state, Ohio. Within a few days, he had devised various expedients to procure rum, but failed. At length, however, he hit upon one which was successful. He went into the woodyard of the establishment, placed one hand upon the block, and with an axe in the other struck it off at a single blow. With the stump raised and streaming, he ran into the house and cried, 'Get some rum! Get some rum! My hand is off!' In the confusion and bustle of the occasion, a bowl of rum was brought, into which he plunged the bleeding member of his body. Then, raising the bowl to his mouth, drank freely and exultingly exclaimed, 'Ah, now I am satisfied.'" Dr. J.E. Turner tells of a man who, while under treatment for inebriety, during 4 weeks secretly drank the alcohol from 6 jars containing morbid specimens. On asking him why he had committed this loathsome act, he replied, "Sir, it is as impossible for me to control this diseased appetite as it is for me to control the pulsations of my heart." End quote. Do the psychoanalysts, or does anyone else, believe that it is impossible to fight a craving of this sort, and that there is nothing to be done but give in to it? I do not think so. But if a craving of this intensity can be fought, why not the so-called normal craving? What would the psychoanalysts consider a normal outlet for a normal craving? Just how frequent would indulgence in a given normal appetite have to be in order to be a normal outlet? Will the psychoanalysts or anyone else deny that indulgence in itself develops and increases a craving? Surely the psychoanalysts are the first to declare that abnormal perversions of the sexual instinct are acquired, that they began and developed because the sexual instinct originally took a wrong turn, and were intensified because that was persisted in. But when one has admitted all this, one has come rather close to admitting the unquestionable truth that the sexual craving, as it appears in the adult human being, is itself, in the intensity and particular form it takes, very largely an acquired craving. Let us grant the psychoanalyst's contention that an attempt to fight the sexual craving, as it has become developed, may involve mental anxiety, and even, if the craving be powerful enough, mental torture for a time. Would not the struggle against the craving for drink, developed to the intensity in the dipsomaniacs just cited, or even in far less intensity, also involve mental anxiety and torture? Any conquest or act of will worthwhile involves that. If there were no price attached to willpower, it could be had for the asking. One last argument may be urged in support of the normality of the sexual desire as opposed to other cravings. It may be alleged that, while in its developed and actual adult form, the sexual passion is largely or partly an acquired one, its form and intensity depending to a great extent upon early environment, imitation, decisions at critical times, frequency of indulgence. Yet the organism is endowed with an instinctive propensity without which the sexual craving is developed would never have come into existence. This is true. I have not denied it. But if it is true of the sexual desire, it is true of every other desire. It is true of the developed craving for rum, for opium, for morphine, for overindulgence in cigarettes, or even in candy, or for mere gluttony. The formation of these cravings is possible because the organism has certain instinctive propensities. Men do not usually form passions for ink drinking, or for molten lead, or for eating gravel, because the organism has no instinctive propensity for these things. Every desire, whatever, no matter how perverted or injurious, is the finished product made from the raw materials of instinctive propensities. There are no other finished products, because there are no other raw materials to make them with. Reduced to its lowest terms, stripped of its scientific pretensions and its pseudo-scientific trappings and terminology, boiled down from a ponderous literature into a single sentence, the contention of the psychoanalysts was long ago expressed in the epigram of Oscar Wilde, quote, "The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it." End quote. It would be unfair to intimate that this epigram accounted for Oscar Wilde's own private character and sexual practice, and I will not do so. If he thought of his private character at all when he penned it, the epigram may possibly have been considered by him as a justification of his course, but this would not mean that it was a cause. The ethical philosophy of most men is a system of apologetics. It is a result of their own conduct rather than a cause and determinant of it. But all these considerations aside, let us judge the epigram on its intrinsic merits. Like all good epigrams, it is at least true in a special sense. And the sense in which the epigram is true is that if you yield to a temptation, you will get rid of it. For the moment. That is all the truth there is in it. For the very fact that you have yielded to the temptation will make it return at a later time with increased power and urgency. Every time you yield to it, you do two things. You increase the intensity of the desire and lessen the power of resistance. You form a habit of yielding. You form a habit of yielding not only to that, but to all other cravings. And we have learned what habits are. You develop and strengthen the craving by use, just as you develop a muscle by use. The parallel is exact. In exercising your muscles, you temporarily fatigue them and wear them down. But this very breaking down of tissues calls nutrition into the worn muscles. And when the fatigue is past and the processes of repair have been completed, the muscles are all the harder and stronger. On the other hand, every time you resist a desire, you strengthen your power to resist. Every desire grows by gratification. Feed the desire, it will fatten and grow great. Starve it, it will greatly weaken. It may even die of inanition. This is the true application of Freud's story of the horse. The common experience, not of neurotics and paranoiacs, but of mankind in general, proves this over and over again. It does not need laboratory experiments or elaborate psychiatry to demonstrate it. It ought not to be necessary, but to shield my remarks from misconstruction and misrepresentation, I want to defend myself against any taint of Puritanism, in the invidious sense in which the psychoanalysts and Mr. H.L. Mencken use that word. I do not denounce the sexual act as immoral in itself. I do not declaim against the gratification of the sexual passions in what the psychoanalysts call a normal married life, provided the gratification is continent and does not reach the point where it undermines or endangers physical and nervous and mental health and well-being. But I do contend that if, through economic or other circumstances, or disinclination, or inability to fall in love, a man either does not marry or delays marriage, it is perfectly possible for him to lead an absolutely chaste and normal life. And of two unmarried men having equal sexual propensities to begin with, the man who voluntarily restrains them the more is the stronger and the better character. I am merely making this one point, that the sexual craving can be fought, that it can be lived down, that it can be conquered, and that the conquest of it would immensely strengthen the character and make most other moral victories comparatively easy. I hold to the idea of Huxley, of a man, quote, who, no stunted ascetic, is full of life and fire, but whose passions are trained to come to heel by a vigorous will, the servant of a tender conscience. End quote. Perhaps there are psychoanalysts who will agree with all this. Perhaps there are psychoanalysts who will protest against my fulminations, saying they do not hold the views I attribute to them, that I either do not understand their views or that I willfully distort them. If I have been unfair, if I have through lack of discrimination blamed all psychoanalysts for the faults of a few, if I have unjustly damned the leaders for the views disseminated by ardent but muddle-headed and ignorant disciples, I am sorry. I have meant only to assault a particular idea. I have tried to be fair, and wherever possible I have taken the psychoanalysts' own words to state their position. But whatever the psychoanalysts do or do not teach, there is no doubt at all about the popular impression of what they teach, and the popular impression, which is the all-important thing, is that they believe it not only impossible to conquer the sexual passion, but highly dangerous to try. This vicious doctrine existed long before psychoanalysts, but the present menace is that psychoanalysis may foster and encourage it by seeming to lend it scientific foundation and support. The doctrine must be utterly demolished, and everything that appears to offer it respect-worthy standing must be examined and exposed. This is all I have attempted to do. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Concentration. Thus far I have spoken of the breaking and forming of habits, and of the acquisition of willpower. But, for the most part, I have given only scattered hints on what to do with your willpower after you have it. Most of these hints have been negative. They have talked of the avoidance of certain acts, and where they have been positive, they have been altogether lofty and abstract. We have now to descend from the empyrean of generalities to the forest of details. Your ultimate ends and yearnings I shall, for the moment, take for granted. I assume that you know what you want, that you have definite ideas on where the treasure of happiness is buried, and that you merely seek aid in securing the implements to dig for it. Your aim in life may be wealth, power, fame, or a partnership in the lime and cement business. Assuming its existence, wherever it may be, and the willingness also to pay the price for it, we have now to inquire how the price is to be paid. Your effort of will is not thrown out all at once. You are not asked to pay cash down in full. You are permitted, nay, you are obliged, to pay for your end in installments, in relatively small efforts of will. But these efforts of will must be continuous and sustained. If you miss a payment, the penalty imposed will be exorbitant, and you will have to make a much greater total payment in the end. On the other hand, if your payments are made promptly, you will find the amount called for diminishing all the time. With most ends, one of the requisites will be the acquisition of knowledge, whether one's ultimate purpose be material success or the pure search for truth. The acquisition of this knowledge will require thought and study, and thought and study will require concentration. Now, this concentration will be mainly of two kinds, what I shall call minute-to-minute concentration, and what I shall call night-after-night concentration. Minute-to-minute concentration is the ability to keep your mind upon a certain subject for a given period, say for 10 minutes, 1/2 hour, or 2 hours, without interruption. Night-after-night concentration is the ability to specialize in a certain subject or in a certain branch of that subject until you have mastered it thoroughly, before advancing to other subjects. Ere I go further, I may have to justify the consideration of this question by asserting that concentration is primarily an act of will. It need not necessarily be so, any more than any other good or noble or success-forwarding act need be an act of will. If you enjoy working, getting up early, remaining home nights, staying sober, you will do so without effort. If you are interested in a book or in a particular subject, you will read it or meditate upon it without effort. But you need willpower in action precisely because you do not enjoy doing these commendable things. And you need willpower in willpower in reading, thought, or writing precisely because your mind will otherwise be distracted by lack or lapses of interest in the subject at hand, or by greater interest in something else. Now, when you take up the sublime task of training the mind to concentrate, you must remember that the act of will involved is the same in principle as any other act of will. Before you begin, you must be certain in your own mind that the end is worthwhile. There is a price attached to concentration, as there is to anything of value. Concentration is not a beautifully abstract quality of mind. We cannot concentrate in general. The very word concentration implies specialization. It means concentrating on some particular thing. When we devote all or most of our time and attention to one particular subject, we must necessarily have less time for other subjects. In other words, we must be content to remain somewhat ignorant of them, at least for a time. This applies particularly to night-after-night concentration. If you devote one evening's study to the quantity theory of money, the next evening to the problem of the freedom of the will, the next to incidents in the life of Theodore Roosevelt, the next to historic types of lampshades, your mind may eventually become an interesting depository of stray bits of knowledge, arousing the same sort of quaint enjoyment in the minds of your associates as an old curiosity shop or a second-hand bookstore in which yellow-backed novels of passion and intrigue rub shoulders with scientific treatises and religious sermons. But such miscellaneous reading is not helping you in any ultimate purpose. You are getting nowhere. You will become neither an economist, nor an ethicist, nor a man versed in biography, nor anything else describable with a complimentary name. By trying to know something about everything, you will not only miss knowing everything about something, but you may miss really knowing anything about anything. Your mind may miss the one advantage of an old curiosity shop, that the pieces of furniture in it, though they may not match each other, are at least in themselves complete. If you give only 1 or 2 evenings to a subject, your knowledge of it may be as useless as a chair with 2 legs. But if you are willing to realize that any useful knowledge whatever requires specialization, that it means keeping evening after evening on the same subject, if you take pride in really knowing something about something, then you will be willing to remain ignorant of certain subjects, at least for a given time. Even if, like Bacon, you take all human knowledge as your province, you must remember that even a traveler who circles the globe can go to only one place at one time. I have spoken here only of keeping to one subject on those evenings on which you do choose to study. I have not spoken of the evenings given to other things. It may not be advisable to give 6 or 7 evenings a week to study. One needs one's play to keep from going stale. But there are limits even to this principle. No man will become an Aristotle or a Duns Scotus on an evening a week. Quote, "Most careers," remarked a newspaper writer recently, "are made or marred in the hours after supper." End quote. What applies to night after night concentration applies with much greater force to minute concentration. If the mind is ever to accomplish anything useful, it must be able to keep itself for a reasonable time on a given subject. The very completion of a train of thought on any subject whatsoever depends on it. And the rules are the same old rules. You must first be fully certain in your own mind that the end is worthwhile. For when you are upon any given train of thought, you will find new paths opening up on either side. Pleasant paths. Paths that seem to lead to worthwhile destinations. Paths you are tempted to explore. But you must force yourself to keep on the road that you began. You must first get to the end of that. You may make mental note of these potential digressions to return to them at some later time. Or, if you fear you are going to forget them, you may make written note of them as they suggest themselves. Concentration is not a virtue in itself. The value of concentration depends entirely on the value of the subject concentrated upon. The only qualification to this remark is that it may often be better really to concentrate upon a less important subject than to play and dabble with a more important one. For the less important subject, if concentrated upon, will at least be mastered. I have dealt with this subject of concentration rather extensively in a former book, Thinking as a Science. It was there treated mainly from the standpoint of the intellect. Here, it must be treated from the standpoint of the will. But as the two cannot really be kept separate, and as I would only be likely to repeat myself anyway, I take the liberty of doing so openly. Quote, "Much of our mind wandering is due to the fact that we are not fully convinced of the importance of the problem being attacked, or that we regard other problems or ideas as more important. Concentration consists in devoting one's mind to the solution of one problem. During our train of thought, associations bring up new ideas or suggest problems which do not bear on the question at hand. Now, when we wander, when we follow up these irrelevant ideas or suggested problems, or when we happen to glance at something or hear something and begin to think of that, we do so because of a half-conscious belief that the new idea, problem, or fact needs attending to is important. I have already pointed out that if this new idea is important, it will be so only by accident. If we were consciously to ask ourselves whether any of these irrelevant problems were as important as the one we were concentrating upon, or even important at all, we should find 9 times out of 10 that they were not. End quote. Mind-wandering is only a habit. It must be broken just like other bad habits. But, I hear you say, all this is beyond my control. I can't keep my mind in a book when somebody insists on talking in the same room. I can't write anything when the family in the apartment upstairs plays the Victrola. I can't keep myself to a train of thought with constant interruptions. But, with all due respect to you, and with full realization of the risk I run of losing your respect, I insist that you can. You have done it. Certain allowances must always be made for the unspeakable noises that other people make. But you can ignore them easily enough when the time comes. Can you not recall when, as a boy, you read The Adventures of Jack Harkaway and the Chinaman, so that you became unconscious of the very room in which you were sitting? Has the memory of the smile given you by a certain wonderful girl never come between you and a very prosaic ledger, obliterating the figures as completely as if they were the fancy and the smile the reality? Has your wife never had to ask you a question 2 or 3 times at dinner before you answered, simply because you were completely wrapped up in some thought of a business unpleasantry that day and did not know that she had spoken? All these forms of involuntary concentration, of which you were not conscious, were possible because the interest in the subject was intense enough. Poverty and freshness of idea and in varied expression tempts me again to quote from myself. Quote, "Whenever a person is left alone for a short time with no one to talk to and no reading matter, when, for instance, he is standing at a station waiting for his train, or sitting at a restaurant table waiting for his order, or hanging on a subway strap when he has forgotten to buy a newspaper, his thoughts tend to run along the tracks they have habitually taken. If a young man usually allows a popular tune to float through his head, that will be most likely to happen. If he usually thinks of that young lady, he will most likely think of her then. If he has often imagined himself as some great political orator making a speech amid the plaudits of the multitude, he is likely to see a mental picture of himself swinging his arms, waving flags, and gulping water. The only way a man can put a stop to such pleasant but uneducated roamings is to snap off his train of daydreaming the first moment he becomes aware of it, and to address his mind to some useful, serious subject. His thoughts will be almost sure to leak away again. They may do this as often as 15 times in half an hour. But the second he becomes aware of it, he should dam up the stream and send his thoughts along the channel he has laid out for them. If he has never done this, he will find the effort great. But if he merely resolves now that the next time his mind wanders, he shall stop it in this manner, his resolve will tend to make itself felt. If he succeeds in following this practice once, it will be much easier a second time. Every time he does this, it will become increasingly easy until he will have arrived at the point where his control over his thoughts will be almost absolute. Not only will it be increasingly easy for him to turn his mind to serious subjects, it will become constantly more pleasurable. Frivolous and petty trains of thought will become more and more intolerable." End quote. End of chapter 12.